What if college football had its own March Madness tournament? It's the kind of question that can only be conjured up deep into the offseason with the season so far away, and as we watch college basketball have its prized postseason tournament, we can only sit and wonder, is this the direction college football is headed? Probably not, but it's still a fun thought exercise to do when we're this deep into the offseason. So in today's video, we're going to explore what March Madness would look like if it were to happen in college football, and then we'll even go ahead and pick the bracket as it would appear as we lay things out. So let's start where March Madness does start, which is with the auto bids. And in college football, this would operate the same way, with the auto bids going to each conference champion. And we look at our conference champions from this last season. We've got Clemson, Army, Jacksonville State, Oregon, Arizona State, Ohio, Boise State, Oregon State from the Pac-12 still counts, Georgia, and Marshall. There are our auto bids for each of those conferences, and I think the auto bids are going to be important here. Conference tournaments, not going to be realistic, even though, yes, a giant field of 64 teams is also unrealistic, but just for the purposes of this exercise, there's not really going to be conference tournaments. We'll just assume that everyone has a conference title game like they do currently. So we take a look at the teams that would be on the bubble in this model with only the 10 auto bids, and we've got teams like Wisconsin, West Virginia, UCF, Arizona, Western Kentucky, UTSA, and in my opinion, not sure what you're thinking about these teams, but these are teams that I think are very deserving of making the tourney. And even if you look at the percentage of teams that would make the tourney in this scenario, it'd be 64 out of the 134 FBS teams. So almost half, 47.8%. And you compare that to the real March Madness tournament, only 18.7%. 68 of their 364 teams are making the tournament. So there's a lot of scarcity that creates value. In this case, we don't have much scarcity in college football. So I feel like there has to be a fix here. And to me, the clear fix is to include FCS teams and FCS conferences in the tourney, because if you include FCS teams, it's going to be now 64 of 263 total teams, which would be the FBS and the FCS combined to make up that number, which is closer to that percentage. Now it's 24.3%, only about a quarter of the league making the tourney, which creates a lot more scarcity. Still not as rare as March Madness or as low of a percentage, but a little bit more realistic. And so with that, let's show what the updated auto bids would look like. This time, not only giving the auto bids to each of the FBS conferences, but including the FCS conferences in there. So we've got Drake from the Pioneer League. We've got Abilene Christian. We've got Mercer in here, Harvard, Incarnate Word, Jackson State. We've got SC State, Richmond, Central Connecticut, North Dakota State, Montana State, Lehigh, and Southeast Missouri, as I struggle to remember some of those teams' names because they're not as big of brands as the FBS teams, but that's what it looks like. We put an asterisk for every team that needed the auto bid to make the tournament, because I already went ahead and made the at-large list, but every team that has an asterisk next to them needed that automatic bid to make it. So Oregon State needed it, so did Jacksonville State, so did Ohio and Marshall from the FBS, and then every single FCS conference needed it. Keep in mind that when we did this last year, there was actually a couple at-large FCS schools. It was very impressive. We had North Dakota State, I believe, and we had South Dakota State both making it as an at-large as well last season. Or it might have been whoever didn't win the tournament that year or their conference that year. But let's go ahead and take a look at our revised bubble now, because the bubble feels a lot more like apples to apples bubble team comparison to college basketball now, because now we're talking about the last four in, being a team like Rutgers, finished at 7-6, was a competitive team in the Big Ten. A team like Oklahoma, this is before they lose that bowl game, and keep in mind actually that none of the bowl games are factored in here. So really for Rutgers, it would be that 7-5 record. For Oklahoma, it would be 6-6. That key win late in the season over Alabama, a huge resume booster for them. With Pitt, we're talking about a 7-5 team. Yes, they end on a losing streak, but still above 500. A couple nice non-conference wins. James Madison gets in there. They were a team that was very close to making the Sun Belt title game, but that's another at-large team. The first four out going to be Utah, Nebraska, Washington State, Texas State. In the case of a team like Utah, just too many close losses down the stretch that didn't hurt their resume too much, but just not enough juice there. Nebraska, they get the nice non-conference win over Colorado that ages really well, but again, just lost too many of those late November games in the Big Ten. And then Washington State, they were on a great path path to making an at-large spot. They get critical non-conference wins over Washington and Texas Tech, but at the end of the day, their resume fell apart when they lost games to Wyoming, New Mexico, and Oregon State down the stretch. We've got Texas State in there as well. They won 8 games this last season in the Sun Belt, but just not enough strength of schedule there for them to get through. Not quite as good as James Madison or tough in the non-conference. And then the next 4 out, we've got Auburn, Kansas, Cal, Washington. Some of those teams very talented. Some got marquee wins, like Cal's win over Auburn, probably what keeps Auburn out of the tourney, but not enough to boost them into it. Those are the teams that were on the bubble and just missing the tournament. So let's go ahead and reveal the tournament field, starting with the West, where we have the Ducks as the number 1 seed, Indiana as the 2 seed, and we look at some of the matchups there, some of the FCS games where Drake will be the sacrificial lamb for Oregon, Jackson State. Who knows? Maybe they could test Indiana for a little bit, but the Hoosiers are very good. But this is one where I think there's some lower seeded teams that have a good shot here. You look at Michigan as the 8th seed, which is intriguing. We look at a team like Clemson sitting in at 4, the conference champion out of the ACC. We see BYU at the 5 spot. They were a good team. Some of the best matchups in this region have got to be UNLV versus Louisiana, a group of 5 battle between really solid teams. Memphis, Georgia Tech is definitely one that's on the radar as a couple of teams that finished the year pretty strong. And then we've got BYU versus Montana State, probably one of the best shots the FCS is going to have at pulling off an upset. Montana State, a very good team. And so the Cinderellas to watch, I would say Montana State, Louisiana, and then maybe Michigan would be one to keep an eye on in the West region. The next region we're going to conjure up here is going to be the South, with Georgia being the 1 seed. You've got another SEC team in Tennessee as the 2 seed. In fact, this is a pretty SEC-heavy bracket. Just how the seeding panned out, it ends up putting them all there. We've got some really fantastic matchups like Florida v. Baylor. Baylor ends on the nice winning streak, if you're not counting the bowl game, which in this case we're not. The Gators also got hot late in the year as well. We've got Colorado versus Arkansas. The Buffaloes were right there in the Big 12 title picture, and Arkansas, a team in the SEC that hopes to prove that the SEC is superior, even though Arkansas lost that game to Oklahoma State during the regular season. And then, of course, we've got Texas A&M versus Texas Tech, a very fun battle and a rivalry that we don't get to see as often. And then we've got the fun matchup of Oregon State, the Pac-12 champions versus the ACC runners-up in SMU. Maybe that could be a sneaky 14 seed that we did watch beat Washington State late in the year. Maybe was a little bit more competitive. Maybe they could have a chance there. The real Cinderellas to watch, though, maybe North Dakota State against South Carolina. We've got Arkansas to watch out for as an 11 seed, and then Rutgers, a 12 seed, taking on the 5-seeded Iowa State Cyclones, who in this case would have just lost the Big 12 title. In the East region, we're going to start off with Penn State at the 1 seed, Notre Dame going to be there as well, so a potential collision course and a rematch of the actual semifinals that would happen here, which in this universe wouldn't have happened, so maybe we'll just see if it happens again. Great matchups here. Minnesota LSU, another 8-9 matchup that would just be absolute cinema to watch because a couple of teams, Minnesota ending the year maybe a little hotter, but LSU still a very talented team. You've got Illinois versus Oklahoma. Oklahoma hoping to make a run into the 12 seed, bottle up what they did against Alabama late in the season, and then Kansas State versus TCU. We end up with a Big 12 matchup in the opening round, but still I think would be plenty entertaining. Some Cinderellas to watch here. Oklahoma out of the 12 seed, James Madison is an 11 seed playing that high-flying Syracuse offense in the first round, and then of course Minnesota out of the 9 seed spot, and maybe even LSU's a team to keep an eye on in the East region. This takes us to the Midwest region, though, with Texas, an interstate matchup versus Abilene Christian in that first round. Ohio State as the 2 seed. We've got Vanderbilt in here as well, Bama with the 3 seed, and then Ole Miss with the 4 seed. Arguably some of the top line teams in this bracket. Some fantastic matchups to take a look at here. We got Army versus Virginia Tech, which is going to be a cool one just for the military ties for both of those universities. Louisville versus Vanderbilt, I think would be a fantastic game. And then Missouri versus Pitt, I think could also be one that's on the table there. But honestly, you're fishing to try and find some entertaining first round value with some of those games. So Missouri versus Pitt, probably not everybody's cup of tea because Missouri would be favored, and that game could get a little ugly with the play styles of both those teams. Cinderellas to watch in this bracket, Virginia Tech as an 11 seed, Vanderbilt as a 10 seed, and then Army as a 6 seed who actually plays Virginia Tech in the opening round. So a couple of teams that maybe could have the potential for a run. But enough talking about these regions. Let's just go ahead and pick these games as if no bowl games were played, and we just jump straight into this tournament after conference championship week. And we're going to start with the West, where in the first round, I think the Ducks take care of business versus Drake. We're not going to see a generational upset pulled off by Drake. Michigan is going to take advantage against Tulane with their physical edge and take them out. Tulane looked pretty bad in the bowl game versus Florida. Yes, they were missing a lot of their guys. They would have those guys. They would have Darian Mensah and some of those other playmakers against Michigan, but the Wolverines had established a certain play style that was working extremely well for them late in the season. It's how we saw them beat both Ohio State and Alabama. So watch out if the Wolverines get hot. We've got BYU taking out Montana State. I do think they avoid the upset, and it's because of how emphatic their performances late in the season were, including that bowl game we saw against Colorado, which technically didn't happen in this universe, but if we're getting that same version of BYU, they're not going to get upset by Montana State. I think Clemson should have no issues against Marshall. Charles Huff still probably going to have one foot out the door, even though they made the tourney, because he's going to be thinking about that Southern Miss job he's about to take. UNLV versus Louisiana is kind of the same thought process. Maybe UNLV is still having Barry Odom looking at that Purdue job, and Louisiana is able to get the best of him with Michael Desmarais and a team that is bought in winning that game. So we do have a Sun Belt team advancing as the 11th seed. That'd be a big upset, our first real upset of this tournament. Boise State should not lose to Harvard. I don't know much about Harvard, admittedly, but I don't think Harvard has a lot of guys that could stop Ashton Genty, and I think that's safe to say. So we got a fun Group of 5 versus Group of 5 matchup in the second round already. Georgia Tech, I think, would get the best of a Memphis team that was a little inconsistent throughout the year. They had discovered something late in the season, but I really think Georgia Tech, with how they were playing late, would have more of a physical edge that would give them the win there. And we did see Memphis almost lose to a pretty shorthanded West Virginia team in the bowl game. And then give me Indiana to beat Jackson State. Again, I don't think we're seeing the crazy upset. So those are the first round results. We got a couple of upsets here with Georgia Tech pulling the win and Louisiana pulling off an upset victory. Let's see if those continue into the second round, which we'll jump into right now, where I think Michigan could and is capable of beating Oregon. And yes, I could sit here and I could just deliver you guys absolute chalk in the bracket, but what's the fun in that? I'm going to explore what if these upsets could happen. And I think if Michigan was capable of beating Ohio State and Alabama late in the season, they're perfectly capable of beating an Oregon team that we saw kind of get exposed on the offensive line against Ohio State. It was some of those issues that reared their ugly head early in the season against teams like Idaho and Boise State that kind of flared up against a team that was playing really well, and Michigan was playing really well. They weren't playing quite to Ohio State's level, although you could argue maybe they were because they beat them head-to-head in rivalry week. So I think Michigan could get the job done here and set up a date in the Sweet 16 versus BYU. I think BYU would do the job versus Clemson. Again, I just loved how hot they were playing late. I think BYU is so underrated. I would love them going into this game as like 10.5-point underdogs and pulling off what would be the upset, the 5/4 against Clemson. So a couple of big time upsets there. On the other side of this region, we got Boise State versus Louisiana, where I think Boise State wins the Group of 5 battle. They dispatched Group of 5 teams all season. They never lost to one. I don't think they're going to end that here against Louisiana. And then Georgia Tech versus Indiana, where once again, I think the matchup kind of favors the underdog a little bit. So call me crazy. I've got the 1 seed and 2 seeds losing here. Indiana was a great team. Their only losses were to Notre Dame and Ohio State, the 2 teams that ended up in the title game. But I don't know, man. Georgia Tech was a team we watched pretty much take down Georgia during the regular season. They didn't quite do it. They couldn't quite finish the deal, but I think they might be able to finish the deal versus Indiana. I think they have what it takes to pull the upset. So this is going to turn the West into pretty much a chaos bracket. So it takes us to the next round where I think we're going to have those 2 underdogs, Michigan and Georgia Tech, take things. Georgia Tech physical enough. We're going to have Kyle Eford going toe-to-toe with Ashton Genty. That's going to be pretty electric. I think Michigan just gets it done again, and we're going to end up with Michigan versus Georgia Tech in our Sweet 16 here, and might as well punch the ticket for the Michigan Wolverines into the Final Four, winning that Elite 8 matchup versus Georgia Tech and winning this region. So things got a little hectic and chaotic. Like I said, yeah, chalk. You could probably just rock with Oregon and Indiana if you want, if you're a boring person, but I'm going to try and be a little exciting. I promise it's not all going to be that unhinged. So let's go ahead and we'll get to the South region next. So in the South region, I'm going to rock with Georgia against Central Connecticut. I don't think that we're going to see the 16 seed pull the upset here. Just too talented from Georgia. Baylor was playing really well at the end of the season, but the Florida Gators had really figured something out, so you trust them in these types of matchups. I'm going to take Florida in this game. Iowa State against Rutgers. Rutgers, I think, has a sneaky upset bid shot here, but Iowa State was also playing pretty dang well. I know that they got pretty handily beaten by Arizona State in the Big 12 title game, but that was a team that was playing with their hair on fire, and I think Iowa State still has the playmakers to get the job done. Be a low-scoring defensive battle, though. North Dakota State may be a potential for an upset, possibly, but South Carolina's pass rushers would not be stymied by anyone on that North Dakota State offensive line, and so I like the Gamecocks there, so we're all chalk through the start of that. I think Arkansas, with how they were playing late in the season and the things they discovered, I think they could beat a Colorado team that we saw with a disheartening effort against BYU, and so give me Arkansas. I'm aware Arkansas lost that game to Oklahoma State. That will be probably the main pushback on that, is that they lost to a worse Big 12 opponent in reality, but I think as an 11 seed here, they could still pull off that upset. We've got SMU versus Oregon State. I don't think the Pac-12 champions pull off the upset. I think SMU wins. Texas Tech versus Texas A&M. Give me the Red Raiders, who are an extremely weird team all year. We watched both of these teams lose their bowl games at the end of the season, but I just think maybe the Red Raiders, playing a team they don't get to play very often, they get up, something magical happens, they pull off a crazy upset, and we get the 10 seed through. And then give me Tennessee versus Richmond. We're not going to see any crazy 15-2 upset, at least at this point. We've got another 1v8 matchup, and it's Florida versus Georgia. During the regular season, I watched Florida be toe-to-toe with Georgia for 3 quarters until DJ Lagway gets injured, and now we're assuming that this is a Georgia team that has an injured Carson Beck against a Florida team with a healthy DJ Lagway. I'm going to rock with Florida. Once again, we're having a 1-seed upset in the second round. I know it seems a little ludicrous, but I honestly believe that's what would happen if we saw the bracket play out exactly like this. Iowa State versus South Carolina. I think South Carolina has a little bit more juice. They were playing with at the late end of the season there to get the win. Arkansas' Cinderella run should be ended pretty swiftly by SMU, and then I think Tennessee would take care of business versus Texas Tech. Some people a little surprisingly low on the Volunteers, but we watched them get squashed by an Ohio State team that was playing supremely well. So a lot of that Tennessee team and the Tennessee buzz from the season, I think, being forgotten. So that sets up our Sweet 16, where we go to the results of those matchups. I think South Carolina would make it happen versus Florida. It comes down to me for the 2 playmakers on the team, Lagway versus Sellers. Who do I trust to make more plays down the stretch? I trust Sellers, and I also trust that South Carolina defensive front I've been raving about to be able to disrupt what Florida had working for them really well late in the season. Even though I know we watched that Florida O-line match up well versus some pretty talented fronts late in the season, it would be a great game regardless. But on the other side of things, I think SMU would give Tennessee their best shot. It would look a little better than that SMU Penn State game, but I do think Tennessee at the end of the day prevails and gets the win against 2 of the actual playoff teams in this last season and sets up an all SEC Elite 8 here, South Carolina versus Tennessee, where I think the Volunteers would get the nod. A couple of teams that I was surprised to see had not played during the regular season this last year. I totally thought they did. I think it'd be an entertaining matchup, but I think Tennessee would just hit a few more big plays. I just trust them play calling wise a little bit more in a big game like this. And so give me the Volunteers punching their ticket to the Final Four and winning their region. So let's get to the next region with the East. So here we are in the East. In the first round, I've got the 1 seed Penn State getting the job done versus Lehigh, and just as a spoiler, I've got Notre Dame beating SC State as well. We should have a great game, but give me Minnesota against LSU. On paper, you're probably going to be picking LSU most of the time in this game, but LSU wasn't playing particularly great at the end of the season. In fact, they lost a couple of games that in blowout fashion and a couple big games. So I like Minnesota, a team that I thought was playing really well. And also, in reality, we saw the Big Ten win a lot of those games versus SEC opponents in bowl games. I also am loving the Illinois over Oklahoma pick here, stopping the Sooners cold in their tracks. Miami shouldn't have any issues versus the CUSA champions in Jacksonville State. Give me Syracuse to take care of business versus James Madison, and one where I could see the scenario where maybe James Madison has an upset bid. They profile well on paper, but I can't doubt that Syracuse Syracuse team. And then give me Arizona State versus Incarnate Word. Maybe Incarnate Word could get a few points up there, but Arizona State just had too many good things going for them this last season. Kansas State wins the all Big 12 matchup versus TCU and sets up a matchup in the second round versus Notre Dame. In the second round, I'm loving Penn State to beat Minnesota. I know the Golden Gophers had a close bid versus the Nittany Lions, but James Franklin has shown time and time again his teams are really good at taking care of business when they're supposed to. And in this game, they're going to be supposed to, and they do. Illinois versus Miami, another interesting one here. I like Illinois, though. Again, Illinois was just playing so well. They beat South Carolina at the end of the year, which isn't canon in this universe, I know, but still really, really great team. And Miami had a little bit of turmoil towards the end of the season. Cristobal's teams just don't play well in November onward, and that's something we've noticed time and time again. Meanwhile, Arizona State and Syracuse both ended the year hot, but give me the Sun Devils, who nearly took out Texas at season's end and had a really successful Big 12 title game. Ton going right for them. Give me Notre Dame over Kansas State. The Wildcats, yes, have some talent, but Notre Dame just had a little bit more, had an edge that we saw come out late in the season that I think would push them to the Sweet 16. In the Sweet 16, though, I think we're going to take Penn State over Illinois, another game where Illinois kind of hung in there during the regular season, but Penn State took care of business, so I'm trusting the Nittany Lions again. Notre Dame versus ASU could be pretty entertaining, especially because of that spirited effort we saw by the Sun Devils, but I'm still going to rock with Notre Dame and give the Fighting Irish the edge. So a pretty chalky region here, and we saw this matchup already in a high-stakes, similarly staked game in the semifinal, the national semifinal, only this time it would be the quarterfinals. So give me Notre Dame over Penn State. We've seen this story before. They advance to the Final Four. Finally, we are here in the Midwest first round, where I'm rocking with Texas and Ohio State to beat their FCS opponents in the first round. We've got a Duke-USC matchup where I think the Trojans would prevail in this one against a 9-win Duke team, but USC just so much better than their record indicated. We saw them show up in the bowl game in real life. I think they'd show up in a similar fashion to this Duke game and take care of business, even with Malik Murphy still playing. We've got Missouri versus Pitt. Pitt was just on a terrible tumble at the end of the year. Missouri was finally getting healthy, so I like Missouri there. Ole Miss over Ohio is, I think, a very easy pick there. Ohio, not a very good 13 seed. Army over Virginia Tech, I think, is one that would happen. Virginia Tech just did not deliver in those big moments throughout the year, and Army showed they could go toe-to-toe versus a solid team when they needed to. Bama against Mercer. Again, Mercer not going to give Bama any issues here, but I think the Vandy boys could go out and beat a Louisville team that was playing decent by the season's end, but Vanderbilt also just a chip on their shoulder, a team that you could never doubt, especially when they were underdogs. So give me Vandy to win that game. In the second round, I think Texas gets the best of USC. Again, Trojans had a lot of inconsistencies. Yes, they lost a bunch of one-score games, but the Longhorns, just a much more complete team that was able to deliver in these types of matchups. Ole Miss, very talented, very good. I think they beat a Missouri team that was coached very well throughout the season and was able to keep games close, but did get folded in a lot of those bigger games like the Texas A&M game and the Bama game. They could get packed up pretty quick against an Ole Miss team that really had the offense back up to nearly full strength by season's end. We've got Bama over Army. I just don't think the Service Academy school could beat Alabama. However, we did see Navy beat Oklahoma, who beat Bama, but I digress. We're not going to go down that train of thought. We'll still rock with Alabama. I think Ohio State takes care of business against Vanderbilt in the second round. We saw them. They were a buzzsaw. Sets up a matchup in the Sweet 16, though, where in the Sweet 16, I believe we see the Texas Longhorns take out an Ole Miss team that had inconsistencies throughout the season, just could not be trusted for a long stretch of time in a tournament like this. And then Ohio State, the buzzsaw aforementioned for Ohio State that they were, which sets up the Elite Eight matchup versus the Texas Longhorns, where Texas's path to beating Ohio State very much exists, and we saw them execute a pretty good game plan against the Buckeyes in the actual matchup. However, I think more times than not, we're talking about an Ohio State victory here, and so that's what we're talking about. Buckeyes getting the win against Texas and punching their ticket to the Final Four. So here's our Final Four. We've got two Big Ten teams, an SEC team, and an independent team. Michigan versus Tennessee, Notre Dame versus Ohio State. One of these matchups we've seen before, one we have not. I think in the Michigan-Tennessee battle, Tennessee would be able to do just enough to expose Michigan's deficiencies, specifically offensively speaking. I don't think it would be quite the type of game the Wolverines want it to be, and I really, like I said, trust Tennessee's play calling in some of these big games. And then I think Ohio State versus Notre Dame, kind of rinse and repeat what we saw in the national title game, where Ohio State takes care of business, and it sets up the Ohio State-Tennessee national title, where we've seen this before. The Buckeyes win it all. Where at the end of the day, there's not any team that on paper I think you could really pick over Ohio State based on how they were playing at season's end, and they showed they could win during a marathon like this. I mean, you talk about the number of high-profile big games they had to win in a row. It was a lot. They're having to win a similar number in a tournament like this because their first game is going to be Southeast Missouri. They've got a game versus Vandy that won't probably test them a ton, and then they've got about 4 high-profile games in a row to win. So we saw the Buckeyes do it in a very similar manner and style. I know that there's other possibilities here. It might be more fun to pick a different team, but really the fun in March Madness is typically in the Cinderella teams, in the Sweet 16 run that we saw from, let's go back and see, from a BYU or the Georgia Tech run or Michigan to the Final Four. Those are the stories that bring you through. And then usually by the end, it's a team most people expected to be in the national title mix. So that is it. That is it. College football had March Madness. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a ton of fun making it. I'm going to use this bracket for my own purposes to keep doing different simulations and seeing who a random simulator would have going out on top. Let me know down in the comments, who do you think would win this thing? Who do you think could make a deep run? Maybe there's a Cinderella I didn't highlight enough, or I wasn't willing to pick, like North Dakota State or maybe Oregon State or something like that. Let me know down in the comments. Also, maybe let me know which 16 seed do you think would have the best shot at pulling off an upset here. That might be a fun thought exercise as well. But that's all I've got for you guys in today's video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're not subscribed already. There's a lot of you that watch these videos that think you're subscribed, but you're not subscribed. So just feel free to double check on that. And I've got more great content coming out for you guys later this week. And in that case, I will see you guys later this week.